management as driven by local events, perhaps, and climate change adaptation by global. But the reality is, of course, as always, much more complex, more complicated than that. The origins of both topics actually also go back many decades. It is often forgotten today that decision risk management originated in the years of the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, in the United States, in the search for analogues for recovery from the aftermath of nuclear disaster, from nuclear war. It was strongly influenced by a physicalist paradigm that saw disasters as discrete physical phenomena, disruptions of normal business as usual. And recovery, of course, was then seen as the restoration of the status quo ante the disaster event, a return to normality. And the emphasis of this kind of work, which was, remember, initiated to help to inform civil defense activities, was a strong emphasis on preparedness, loss minimization, and also including, in the case of natural disasters, more localized monitoring. And decision risk management remains strongly influenced by this paradigm, notwithstanding efforts to socialize the field, influenced very much by Kai Erikson's classic work on floods, everything in its path, and Chick Perot's normalization of accidents, those kinds of ideas. Turning to climate change, oddly enough, there's even a connection there with the Cold War, although admittedly a rather more tenuous one. I wrote in around 1990 or 1992, as I recall, a paper in which I described or suggested that climate change, if it had not arisen, would have been something that at that particular stage in history humanity would have had to invent, because it was part of the reorganization or reorientation of societies to a post-Cold War paradigm, that instead of having the bipolar world between the communist world and the non-communist world and Russia and America, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, in a sense there needed to be another focus around which to organize a lot of international relations, international collaboration, and what better than an external non-human threat, or at least a more generalized threat coming from one that's not directly identifiable with particular political units. Climate change adaptation has a long history. It originated as a proposed option for responding to global warming that was raised by scientists in the 1970s in particular. But by the mid-1980s, climate change adaptation had become a taboo subject. It was not possible to talk about climate change adaptation in the polite company of environmentalists. At that time, I was living and working in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and it struck me that it was very much like talking to American Southern Baptists about sex education in schools. This was something to be discouraged because it encouraged kids or firms and governments, respectively, to think that it was okay to engage in the bad practices that they were engaging in because there was some kind of prophylactic fix that could be brought to bear. So that lifting of taboo, the lifting of that taboo, I think, has happened in the last half dozen years or so, particularly in part due to the realization that we are irrevocably committed already by existing greenhouse gas emissions to a certain degree of climate change, regardless of any greenhouse gas mitigation efforts that we may choose to engage in. But it was also in part due to increased attention to climate variability. And that increased attention to climate variability was itself linked to improvements in modeling efforts in the mid-1990s that seemed to hold out the prospect of reliable short-term climate forecasting on sort of 30, 60, 90, 180-day timeframes, and particularly forecasting El Nino-related events, monsoon events, and so on. Alas, the progress that was made in that mid-90s period has not been sustained, or at least the pace of it. It slowed down considerably. But it did at least raise the question of, and it raises the question for us today, I think, about whether we are talking about adaptation to climate change, or are we talking about adaptation to climate recognizing that climate is itself a dynamic and changing phenomenon. And I think that's a very important issue because it relates back to the physicalist paradigm in decision risk management, which sees change or the risk as being a disruption to normality and a return to the status quo ante. So we have different kinds of concepts here, I think, about what's involved in adaptation. Current adaptation to climate change, I think, suggests a very mixed record. In some ways, we've been very good at it. We have heating systems, air conditioning systems, long histories of building design, clothing design. But interestingly enough, in the past few decades in particular, many of the ways in which we historically adapted to climate have been blurred, smeared out into a sort of delocalized technological response. Some of you may be familiar with the traditional Queenslander home in Australia, which was built on stilts, very large overhangs of the eaves of the roof. This really enabled a lot of natural cooling to occur. With the introduction of air conditioning into Queensland, you see people are walling in the lower story below the stilts and putting living quarters down there and relying increasingly on air conditioning, and therefore actually in many ways substituting one kind of adaptation for another. Delocalized technological adaptation, I think in some ways can be said to have encouraged high-risk vulnerability. There's a lot of concern often expressed about the cost of storm damage, particularly in Florida from hurricanes. I will go so far as to say all of the increased costs associated with water and wind damage in Florida since the Second World War stem from putting expensive infrastructure in silly places, not in fact from increased storm intensity. If you look at a picture of Miami Beach in the 1930s, there was one 8-story hotel. You look at it today and you see the kind of vulnerability that we have actually created through our own patterns of settlement. I think it's also important to note with respect to this question of the physicalist paradigm, not just whether we're talking about climate change, but actually what's the background rate of social and technological change. And this is something which is often not highlighted in discussions either of decision risk management or of climate adaptation. And I think we also need to be very wary of the plausibility of universal metrics of vulnerability. People trying to say, you know, is Bangladesh more vulnerable than the United States? Well, it depends vulnerable to what. In the year that Hurricane Andrew hit the United States, there was something like 74 deaths. The financial damage was such that Allstate wanted to withdraw from the state of Florida and wasn't able to because of the regulator. Meanwhile, in Bangladesh, the cyclones in Bangladesh that year conservatively killed over 250,000 people. Probably more, those were just the official death records. And nobody's ever bothered to really seriously assess the property damage. It was really barely considered to be an issue. So vulnerabilities are different, not greater or lesser. I think, finally, the last point that I'll raise before handing you over to the speakers is that I think that we have seen the emergence of a tension between two models of both disaster risk management and of climate adaptation. One could be described as the predict and provide model. That tends to, I think, be the one that seeks to preserve or restore the world as we find it. It sees climate change as an optimizing problem, encouraging, I think, benefit-cost thinking, rather than the kind of strategic thinking that we have seen, for example, in the response of governments to the financial crises of the past 12 months. Nobody did a benefit-cost analysis or attempted to optimize the decision to nationalize banks in the US and the UK, to nationalize Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, AIG, so on and so forth. A strategic threat was perceived, and the appropriate measures, or what would seem to be appropriate measures, were taken to respond to it. That's very different from trying to optimize around what is the level of climate change that's going to occur and to which I must adapt. That approach, I think, also assumes that improved prediction is a prerequisite for improved policy, which raises another interesting question, which is what is the relationship between science and policy? In my own view, the science of climate change since at least 1992 at the latest, I'd probably even pitch it earlier, was plenty good enough to inform policy in very sensible ways. It was certainly as good, if not better, than most of the technical information that routinely informs government decision-making in the areas of the economy, industrial policy, immigration policy, so on and so forth, let alone decisions to invade Middle Eastern countries. And yet somehow or other climate science was held to a platinum standard of proof. What we actually saw was the displacement of the policy debate about what to do about climate change into the science area where a surrogate was being, policy debate was being conducted in the language of science. And I think we need to be very aware of that phenomenon when we're talking about adaptation to climate change. On the other hand, I think there's the alternative approach is one that's quite fashionable, is to talk about resilience. It's something to which I naturally incline in my own sympathies, but recognize it to be problematic. It's a term that's subject to multiple interpretations, from the idea of bouncing back to where you were before, which is the restoration of the status quo again, rearing its head, to the sort of regroup and move on capacity kind of approach to resilience. And I think we need to recognize in our discussions that range of usages if we're going to make progress in our debate today. But the resilience approach, it seems to me, starts with questions about what levels of security a community wants and questions of the problem of how to decide. So these are strategic decision-making problems rather than calculations. Revealed preferences may be okay for incremental responsive adaptation, but probably not appropriate for anticipatory adaptation, particularly where this involves major infrastructure and capital commitments. Whereas the danger in the prediction and provide model is the one of, I think, mistakenly characterizing the science and policy relationship. There is a danger here of seeking to risk-proof society against every eventuality, which clearly is also problematic in itself. Anyway, with just those opening sort of considerations, I will now hand over to the speakers, and the first speaker is Alan Lavelle. Thank you, Alan.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank you for lending us your ears to listen to this session. What I'll be doing is following on from what, in fact, Steve has just excellently presented. I will be doing a more generic and general job, trying to lay out certain factors that relate to what are we talking about with these two different things, and what are the opportunities and the things which get in the way of bringing them closer together. I'll try and do that in 12 minutes, and if not in 15. First, it must be fairly obvious, and yesterday we heard 3 of the inaugural speech people and Professor Sen mention climate change as a significant, today, environmental and social problem. We know disaster risk management is an important area of concern. Things like Katrina, the tsunami, tend to bring this to mind every now and again. And every day and every month in many communities throughout the world, smaller scale disasters occur which draw the attention of local populations, local governments, and which probably accumulatively lead to more loss than the large scale disasters that occur every now and again. So the problem is no problem in saying both problems are significant. Attempts to bring them together or look at the limits to getting them together take 3 different forms nowadays. There is an increasing literature by people trying to see what the similarities and differences are. This can be seen in the work of people like Lisa Schiffer, Mark Pelling, Ian Burton, Francisco Sekeli from different parts of the world. A second tack on this is things like the scoping studies which the Norwegian government with the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction has in fact promoted recently, in the Nairobi agreements. And the third factor, which is probably the most interesting of them all, is the way people on the ground see the problem and the links between it. I've recently been working with what are called best farmers in Andean indigenous communities in Bolivia called Yapuchiris, who, when confronted with our ideas on climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction, tell us that it is us that makes that distinction, not them. That on the ground, these are similar things. We are dealing with environment and how to adapt to it. We have to change, in their case, our bioindicators, our ways of predicting climate, but basically life goes on as before. And consequently, the two have been brought together in different academic and practitioner circle ways. Prior to going on, it really is important, and you'll realize why it is important, that one says, where does one come from as an individual in this particular area of concern? I'm an economic geographer. I am a self-exiled Brit who's been living for 35 years non-stop working and living and loving in Latin America. I look at things from the southern perspective. I am an urban and regional development specialist who got into risk through development concerns, poverty, exclusion, marginality. And I get into this topic and analyze it from a disaster risk management angle. And I mention this because the way I got into it will color the way I see the problem. We do hear about the difficulties of the two communities communicating on concepts and definitions, whereby mitigation, exposure, vulnerability are used in different ways by the climate change community, adaptation, and the disaster risk management community. But the problem is not only there. It is within our own communities. We are very diverse in the ways we see things, the way we construct our concepts, our definitions. Consequently, the way I look at it, risk as a social construction, risk as a problem of the permanent accumulation of vulnerability, is not necessarily the way that Enrico Quarantelli or Charles Perrault or Ken Hewitt or Ben Wisner or Anthony Oliver Smith or Mary Douglas or Aaron Wildavsky, who are classic writers of different disciplinary approaches to disaster, would look at the problem of disaster. We do not have a common field theory of disaster yet. It is a multidisciplinary task, but which is still predominantly looked at from disciplinary angles, and the difficulties of defining things, concepts, etc., is extremely difficult. In Latin America, you can talk about hazard, risk, disaster, vulnerability to different people, resilience, now the new one that's come up, and people will give you different interpretations of what we're talking about. Consequently, it is not just a matter of the ACC community, the DRR community, getting together, understanding on common terms. It is a matter of within the fields of thought themselves, there are diverse differences which do impede the construction of this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach, which we argue for constantly. Disaster risk management as such has, as Steve put forward, a long development. The sociologists would say that the Halifax explosion in 1917 was the beginning of the sociology of disaster. We have gone through the people I have mentioned previously and dozens of others who have made very significant attempts at trying to get together with the idea of concepts. We have had the flow from disaster to risk. This is really interesting. In Latin America, you will not hear people talk about disaster management anymore. They talk about disaster risk management or risk management because the emphasis has changed from disaster to risk, the conditions which guarantee that disaster will occur at some time. That does not happen all over the place. It is not in all parts of the world. Whatever the differences we have in terms of how we look at disaster risk management, there are a series of things which maybe we can say we can all agree on. Firstly, we are basically within the framework of normal life, within the framework of normal environmental conditions, normal climate, if such a thing exists, we are dealing with how to reduce and avoid loss associated with things that are called extreme events. I do not like the term because there is more damage associated with non-extreme events many times than with extreme events themselves because of vulnerability and exposure factors. But for the moment, just to keep this short, we can talk about anomalies, extreme. So disaster risk management has always worked within the world, a framework of diverse physical events, attempting through a formula which is subjective and objective, adequate or acceptable risk to reduce the losses associated with these events. And we're working within a multi-hazard framework. It is not just climate. It is earthquakes, it is hurricane, it is volcanoes, etc. So those are the certain parts of what we can commonly agree with. When we get to adaptation, the bringing together of things is somewhat more difficult. Sorry. And I must admit, and I'll be very frank about this, the term adaptation does not please me at all. It strikes me as a very, very easily absorbed idea which has very little of a concept. It does not lead me to think about the construction of actions. It is like a box you put many things in. If you read the literature on adaptation and you ask the question, to what are we adapting? You will find we are adapting, both natural and human systems are adapting. That's very strange, they're very different. Obviously the processes are very different. Adaptation is faced with real and now change, but it's also the anticipation of future change. It is adaptation to normal climate change in the sense of changing averages of rainfall, of temperature, of wind, or is it adaptation to the new extremes which will be built into the new climate variability in the future? What are we adapting to? All of these things are different. It is moving from areas that have been flooded by rising sea levels. It is adapting to polar loss of ice. It is tundras that are being thawed out and being... It is a potpourri of things that deny any ability, from my perspective, to be as precise, and here I'm going to be very parochial, of a type of conceptual discussion which has occurred within the disaster risk management framework and which has still not got us to a common feeling along the way. And so there are a whole series of things. So the last point before Steve actually does become draconic. There are a whole series of things. Okay, we could go on and lay out even more of these different types of differences. I would suggest, for instance, that you cannot adapt to extremes. You can increase resilience, you can reduce vulnerability, you can cope, you can get by, you can respond, you can put, as the Tufts University study recently published, you can put the 1,600% growth in the funding which will have to be put to respond to disasters associated with climate change. Well, they put the range between 56% and 1,600%. Depends what parameters you build into your models. Another problem. And so, what can we do about this? How can we see the bringing together of the two things? In the risk management side of things in Latin America nowadays, it is very common to hear, and this is going through the UN system as well, the distinction between what we call corrective and prospective risk management. Corrective risk management from the disaster risk management side is dealing with risk which is now on the ground. It is the product of human errors, of location, the building in of vulnerability into new hospitals and schools. It's the 2 million classrooms in Latin America that will fall down with a moderate level earthquake because they weren't built correctly in the beginning. It is the people living on the sides of ravines, all there because of the forced and obliged occupation of space due to poverty, inequality, vulnerability, marginality, and exclusion. And so corrective risk management is dealing with risk on the ground. We could say in the climate change side, you're also dealing with risk which is on the ground, but it is different because things that have been put on the ground 10 years ago and are now faced with climate change today will have to adjust to that change, and that could be called corrective management. But it is when you come to the future, the prospective side of it, what are we talking about? We're talking about the country I live in, Costa Rica, has 4.5 million population today, and within 30 years it will have 9 million. It now has so many schools, it will have double that, it will have double the infrastructure, it will have double the production in agriculture, etc., and probably in tourism. In what condition of risk is that going to be? If we look at it from the adaptation to climate change, this prediction in the future, which with certain certainty we could do in the past because we had the models of probable periods of return, all of this stuff is going to stop. The average is going to change, the extremes are going to change if we believe the literature, and we're going to have to start thinking prospectively in a sense of uncertainty, which we have not had to do historically with disaster risk management. But what does this mean? And I think this is the final point. Where can we go with this? From my perspective, it means there has to be a complete breakdown of the division between, in the climate field, adaptation to climate change and disaster risk management in the climate field. We are going to have to think about integrated sectoral and territorial planning, which takes into account climate as one of the factors determining what is the most secure and sustainable development of the future. We will stop having to look at disaster risk management and even adaptation as an adjunct to, an addition to, something you build onto development to make it better. We have to get to grips with the idea that disaster risk management and adaptation is an integral part of thinking about development. It is not taking a development model and weatherproofing it. It is changing our development model such we don't get to the conditions of vulnerability and climate change which is there. Third is, there is no way. Yeah, this is my last two phrases. We have to get to the idea that we cannot predict the future in these events. The uncertainty is too high. Our only opportunities are reducing general vulnerability in the society, increasing resilience of society, and in the reduction of the 2 billion poor in the world, for instance, we will have moved very much forward to people being more resilient and being able to adapt to climate change in the future. And we're going to have to transform our institutional arrangements, which have been built up on the idea that the climate change problem is an environmental problem and the disaster risk problem is one of disaster response, when neither of them are one or the other. The adaptation to climate change problem is a development problem. And the disaster risk management problem is a development problem, and these things are going to have to go through development institutions and leave the ministries of environment and civil defence and get into a middle ground of development planning sectorally and territorially. Thank you very much.
I mentioned that Alan is the coordinator of the Social Study of Risk and Disaster Programme at the Latin American Social Science Faculty. I won't be remiss and fail to identify the affiliation of our next speaker, who is Colleen Vogel, who is the BMW Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. Thank you.
Could I ask the gentleman at the back just to come and help me quickly? Thank you. Whilst we're doing that, can I just say that I'm no longer the BMW chair for various reasons. I'm sure you could guess some of them. Maybe my incompetence, I'm not sure. And I'm also not the Professor of Sustainable Development. I'm a professor really just of geography and climatology. So having clarity. My name is spelled correctly, which is unusual. It's that one, yeah. All right, I'm going to follow on from the discussion that has taken place so far. So that is forward, right? Thank you. Particularly on the issue of institutions that was raised. And I'm going to go quite quickly because I believe I have got very limited time. My area of work, I live in Southern Africa and I work a lot with communities, particularly those who are at risk. And more particularly, I'm a climatologist by training, so I'm not a card-carrying member of the social sciences. And I apologize to most of you in the audience. But what I want to share with you is to try and get your advice on how we can look at some of these things about rational choice, information for better living with risk, and so on. So I really want to throw out some ideas that might be useful. I was very fortunate to be part of the IPCC. I was actually part of the Africa chapter and also part of the coordinating group that pulled the whole thing together. And just very briefly, you don't need to be a rocket scientist or any BMW, whatever. You can see that the top part of Africa looks as if it's going to come under stress according to some of the current models. And the middle diagram, that's in terms of temperature. The middle diagram shows you, rainfall. And obviously, we've got problems where we have very limited data. So Southern Africa is a hot spot. Many governments are pouring tons of money into this. So what can we do about it? How do we measure some of the risks? Just very quickly to say that there are huge pockets of society or groups of people who are trying to quantify these risks so that we can do something better with them. one of my colleagues from the University of the UCT, Elsa Holloway. We're trying to quantify what it'll cost us if we have repeated events of the type that we already experience. So there's a demand for information. Likewise, we have regional crises when we have severe droughts in the area, and as we've already heard, Stephen said, that these are not necessarily unusual, they're part of our common package, but they cost. Every time they impact on very vulnerable communities, they draw down GDP, and they are quite severe. So again, how do we buffer ourselves against that? Increasingly, humanitarian organizations are also coming to play in the area, and they are wanting to get information on climate change and how better can we manage that risk. And the Red Cross, for example, has approached me to possibly work with them to see how we could look at information and gear themselves up more around climate change and climate risk. Interestingly enough, we did a little study amongst a couple of communities in Southern Africa, and we just asked them what 3 things drive your vulnerability, in this case to climate risk. And one of the things, and I didn't distort this model, but the key thing that came out, which we were quite surprised about, was not HIV/AIDS or any of those other drivers of risk or vulnerability, but in fact information. People wanted access to information, even if they were emerging farmers, which is not surprising because many farmers are not just living off the land in a subsistence fashion, but are trying to get into the market. So to follow on from what Stephen said, Stephen said earlier, in the 1990s, late 1990s, we were really good at trying to get information about risk of climate. These are what we call seasonal forecasts, and you can see it's for the current year that we've got. And essentially, you can see that some of these models, which are very good, are predicting generally wetter conditions in certain months of the year coming up, and then in other parts of the country or the region, drier conditions. And what we can do with this information, although it's uncertain, we can transform that into a message which could be useful for various farmers and others. But I've been working with these emerging farmers, not subsisting farmers, and they don't often have access to internet. And what they're asking me, are there not other conduits of information? Now, the interesting thing is, coming back to Alan's point, is that the current institutional arrangement for the provision of this information is agricultural extension. And the farmers that I've been working with have been working with agricultural extension. They've said to me that they haven't seen them for 10 years, even though they live 10 kilometers down the road. So there's a problem. We do have information that I think can be used very, very interestingly, not just in a conduit, but in a dialogue kind of way. But the institutional structures that have been put up to flow or assist with this information, I think, are quite problematic. But I want to now expand that a little bit, and this is where I come to the social scientists, because that's a very, if you like, normative way of looking at things, a very reductionist way, positivist science, and there's this idea that you create the message and everyone will come and collect it. Well, it doesn't happen. And why? Because people have very interesting institutions in which they work. Water users work in certain kinds of setups. They have certain rules and obligations that they have to fulfill. Likewise, planners. So business as usual at the moment is like this. We have a linear model where the weather services are very well-meaning, but they want to create a message and then take it to the people. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that that doesn't always work because the languages are used. It's probabilistic information. It's very difficult to portray in a very simple flow model. But unfortunately, I'm trained in some ways, maybe it's unfortunate, I'm a geographer, so I was trained as a climatologist, and I just thought, well, we've got such good science, we just need to get it out there. So what we were doing in the beginning was going around to all these, and I really feel sorry now, these poor farmers and saying, you've got to get the message, this is a probabilistic forecast, let's roll a dice, show you what probability means, how, you must use this stuff, this is going to save you. Well, it was an interesting experience, and we learned a lot from that. But I think we've got a problem, a major problem, and I don't think this is rocket science. But I really do think that, and I'm sorry about the bridging notion, because I don't think it's a bridge, I think it's more a spider web. I think these are very complicated mechanisms that go on here. And what worries me is that if climate change is real, and I know I'm running out of time now, but if climate change is real, we've got to really think smart about some of these relationships. So as I come to a close in my talk, what I'd like to ask you as an audience maybe to come and chat to me afterwards, because I'm really grappling with this, is how do we rethink these roles of institutions? I don't believe one size will fit all. And as we heard from Alan, we've moved from this kind of risk-reactive approach where we have a disaster and then we clean up afterwards. And most of our legislation, including mine in Southern Africa, is now much, much more expansive, where we try and put the information into business as usual. The problem is that the institutions are not geared up for that kind of approach. So you've got this well-meaning legislation that is completely misplaced. So just to come back to wrap up, so we have, for example, information, a forecast, and traditionally we've tried to force feed it down to users. And what I'm suggesting is that I think we really need to be thinking hard about adapting our institutions. But having listened to the very eloquent plenary this morning, I'm more sort of confused than I was before. And I don't know if I ever want to get up and talk anymore, because am I a rational choice behavioral thinker, psychologically in need of therapy or whatever? But anyway, but I'm losing time by making jokes. But again, when you work with farmers, you know, it's not rocket scientists. As a scientist, a traditional kind of, you know, climatologist, you kind of thought like this. And again, surprise, surprise, you know, it didn't happen like that. You know, people make decisions, they stop, they rethink, they go back. It's very, very complicated. So, what does this mean for disaster risk and adaptation and climate change? I believe the earlier work of Margie Buchanan Smith and others really needs to be thought through, and Mickey Glantz and others. We need to rethink the way we've been doing things. Maybe not necessarily turn everything, throw everything out, but really rejig them. So early warning systems have traditionally been very much like I've been showing you, top down, going down to the ground. But that's going to require a lot of rejigging. And again, I ask, do we have time? So I think we really need to get moving. The alternative approach, which a colleague of mine and I have been looking at, is to try and look at that wider user environment, look at the dialogues, look at the institutional issues that they frame. So in a sense, it's kind of unpacking this and working backwards. Do I understand the farmers' information needs? Do I understand where they're coming from? What kinds of information sources have they been using to manage risk droughts for years, 200, 300 years, you know, if not longer? So forecasts as a tool, I think we need to be very careful. Most of my colleagues are replicating these kind of linear flow models. Personally, I think we have to stop that. I don't think it's very, very useful, but it's generated a huge adaptation literature on this. And I don't need to talk about this to those of you in the room, but land tenure are huge issues. Even if you gave a farmer a forecast, he can't act on it because he has to negotiate how he uses land. Subsidies, they might not even get it from the bank. Agricultural extension, I believe, is the wrong source. And the very eloquent chair, he himself, with his colleagues, has looked at all of these issues. And in fact, I think the title of the paper was Forecasts Are for Wimps. Are for Wimps. And I mean, I think a lot of the issues that were raised in that paper, I think, resonate with some of the things that I'm trying to say. That we're assuming a business as usual operational mode, and I don't believe that that still exists. So, here's my suggestion for perhaps a solution, but I'm not sure it's going to work. And I've really been struggling about this. And in fact, I've had a midlife crisis and might even retire from academia. One of the things I believe is that, unfortunately, in many countries, particularly in Southern Africa, they want to set up new silos of climate change, which will now sit next to planning and whatever. And depending on my new president, who knows what's going to happen, but hopefully we can have an influence. I believe that that's not necessarily the only structure, and I'm hearing a lot in this conference about organizational theories, etc. One of the interesting things I've come across, but I'm not sure how it would work, and I'd need to speak to people who are experts on this, but is trying to find boundary organizations or middle people, brokers, ways that you can clip in alongside people without rejigging everything, and you really start to do the social learning that you need and all that sort of thing to understand your agents that you're operating with. So just to give you an example in terms of climate change, these are some of the things we could look at, I think. Disaster risk management plans, looking at the various forums that we already have. Yes, I'm coming to the end. 2 minutes. So the take-home message that I'd like to leave you with is I really do believe we have good science. The science is uncertain on climate change, as we know. But I think we've got enough to not just say, oh, it's all hopeless, we don't know what to do. The problem is, and I'd like to endorse what Alan said, I think we need to, this adaptation term is quite nebulous. And I think we do need to be trying to think about how we can do more with less. So I think we've got a lot of lessons we can learn from community-based work, and I'm sure the next speaker will be doing much more on that. But I'd also like to really bring you home to that last point right at the bottom. My take-home message is looking at alternative institutional designs or configurations, not necessarily doing social engineering, but trying to find out which kinds of groups need what kind of information and what they can tell us about the way that they configure their risks. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think it's really necessarily rocket science, but what I'd like to leave you with is we're in the Southern African region really grappling with science and development. We're trying to open up new spaces for dialogue, which is what I'm suggesting. And I think it really sounds trite, but I think we really need to not only be looking at the vertical integration mechanisms that we have traditionally been using. For example, if I was going to draw an early warning system there, it would be you get the science and then you shove it down the throats, basically, of people down here. But really, I would like to be trying to find ways of how do we do more of this horizontal integration. But what that looks like and what that institutional frame looks like is very, very difficult. But I think that might be a solution to bringing these two communities together, those who are working on adaptation and those who are also working on disaster risk reduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and we earnestly hope that you won't give up your academic career, even if you have had to forego the BMW Sustainable Development title. You clearly raised a lot of important issues there. I think there's sort of tension between the rational choice linear model and what you presented as an alternative is particularly one that we could fruitfully explore. Question is, what are the possibilities for synthesis between these, given that they give different types of insight and information? And is it possible to incorporate your alternative model without it simply always defaulting to the rational model and the predict and provide? And I think that's a real challenge of institutional design. Hopefully we can have some discussion of that in a moment. We're going to go on now to our next speaker, who is David Johnston. And David is the Associate Professor at the School of Psychology at Massey University in New Zealand. David.
What I want to do is, whilst my talk has been loaded, is really address some of these issues around community-based programs and just touch on some of the research that we've been done in New Zealand, really confirming what a lot of you know, that some of the traditional approaches of pumping out hazard information really haven't been effective. And it's been a concern of a number of us in New Zealand and other countries, a lot of work in the US, that despite the growing disasters and there's been a considerable continuation of public education initiatives really pumping out information about the hazards. The idea that if you tell an uninformed public, an uninformed community, these are the risks, that they will do the actions you recommend. And the research is most often quite disappointing. They have not achieved the levels of preparedness in communities in Japan and the US where we've measured it. The public doesn't always get it, as some people say, but I think we've looked at the problem the wrong way, and we need to explore different ways of understanding how do we engage communities and we get the communities to undertake the actions that we would like them to do. What I want to do now is share briefly a case study from New Zealand. The city of Auckland is the largest city in New Zealand, over 1 million people, sits on top of an active volcanic field. If you had a choice in the future, probably wouldn't put a city there, but we've chosen to, and it's unlikely that we're going to move the population from this volcanic field. It last erupted about 600 years ago. It has a return period of around 600 years. So sooner or later, we may well face a volcanic eruption in Auckland. Now, the Auckland Regional Council, the local government there, was concerned about public awareness and preparedness for this and other disasters. So they engaged a survey company, a marketing company to develop a multimedia public education initiative. It had TV ads, it had public talks, it had radio, materials in schools, lots of materials. What was quite pleasing at the time, we had no input into the design of the program. They did commission us to do an evaluation of it. Now, this is another point which is quite common. How many millions of dollars are spent on public education worldwide with zero spent on evaluation? This case, they generously funded us to do an appropriate evaluation for the size of the program. We were able to do a telephone survey of a random sample of Auckland residents before and after, and we're able to look at some of the issues. And unfortunately, we told them what we probably could have suggested beforehand. that there was actually no change in behaviour after your exercise. What we did find out beforehand, and it was confirmed afterwards, that the public largely were aware that this was a volcanic field. So pumping education about that this is a volcanic field really seemed to be a little pointless when 95% of people already knew it was. But a number of people had taken measures to prepare for disasters. But what we were able to do in telephone surveys was quite interesting. We asked the community, the respondents, to name the things that they should do to prepare, their knowledge about preparedness. And 46% of people were able to name the 5 steps for preparing for a volcanic eruption as advertised in the Yellow Pages. Now, in a telephone survey, you can ask the next obvious question, name them. Well, we had about 5% of people could. So that shows another bias that we have in populations of people over-reporting their knowledge and preparedness levels. And we often find when disasters do occur that levels of preparedness were way less than people thought. And it also comes across in organisations, emergency management agencies who think they're prepared. When the day of judgment comes, they find their systems lacking. Now, what was very interesting in the survey before and after was that after the very slick media campaign, 28% of people stated that they intended to reduce their levels of preparedness. It actually had the opposite effect. The whole campaign was to increase levels of preparedness. But what we found was people were seeing, I worried about the problem, but now I know what the city officials are doing. You have all these plans, you're monitoring. I have less reason to worry about it. So public education and awareness activities can actually cause the opposite to what is intended. It can actually reduce your levels of preparedness in your community as people will transfer the risk from themselves to other comparable agencies. So at times, a lot of these well-intentioned efforts really backfire. One of the things we've been looking at the City of Auckland is what are the attributes that make communities resilient? What are the factors that predict preparedness? And how can agencies adjust these? And this is where we've taken a more broader look at some of the notions around adaptive capacity. What are the elements individually, collectively, in institutions that predict the ability and show the ability of organisations to prepare? Now, there has been a lot of talk about resilience, and I'll take up my 12 minutes plus a lot more discussing it, but really you need to look at resilience on a number of levels, both from a natural and the built environment, but also about attitudes and behaviours and community and cultural factors. It is a multifaceted thing. What we've been looking at is what in our survey work are the predictors for preparedness and making, which I haven't got here, is a slide before that. Before people prepare, they often will form intentions to do it. There are barriers that will stop you preparing even if you form an intention. What we've been exploring is some of the factors that predict intentions to prepare. What we find, red being a negative correlation, is that if people have a negative outcome, they don't believe that the issue that you're facing is worth preparing for, they're not going to. And we found the opposite. Obviously, if people have positive outcome expectancy, they believe that the action is going to make a difference, it is a predictor that they may form intentions to prepare. But these forming intentions to prepare and preparing were actually influenced by a number of factors. And the 3 most powerful predictors was about the ability and the capacity for people to discuss the problem, to be part of the solution, the empowerment they feel in being part of it, and the trust that they have in the agencies. And there are links to it. Now, this is data from one particular model, and these may manifest themselves in different ways in different communities, and our research indicates that that is exactly the case. There is no simple model for resilience, and it does have a cultural and environmental and a social and community context to it. But it is quite useful to think about it in terms of a series of interrelated factors, and you need to understand these to be able to understand why simply information provision alone does not lead to that intention and action. What we see is that if people have action coping skills, they're more likely to participate in the community activities. If they participate in community activities, they feel more empowered. If they feel more empowered, they're more likely to trust. And all of these things often leads to increased levels of preparedness. So this is work of Douglas Payton and others, Douglas from University of Tasmania, and really shows that resilience is not a simple measure. There are a number of overlapping community, societal, environmental, and personal factors. But I think we need to understand this rich mix of issues that people need to overcome in order to prepare. And simply providing information without giving them a context, without giving them an opportunity to be involved, to formulate the answers, is less likely. So it all comes back to things that the development researchers and development practitioners have known for a long time, that there are a number of social factors, community factors that need to take part, need to happen. There are issues around justice and distributed justice, about community capability and competence, trust, empowerment. These things need to come together in order to get people to prepare for future events. We need to provide the opportunities for people to participate in finding the answers to these complex problems. So we go back to the original notion that the public education people can just change the world by good science, good knowledge. Yes, you do need good science, good knowledge. You need to communicate that to the public, but public information provision alone will not bring about the changes we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and impressively well within the time constraints. It appears that one of our speakers, Ortwin Wren, has not actually made it. So we may have a little bit more time for discussion afterwards, an opportunity for the panelists perhaps to dilate a little bit on things that they felt they were rushed through. So unfortunately, since Ortwin is not here, I'm going to go to our final speaker, who is Bill Hook, who is the Senior Policy Fellow and Director of the Policy Program of the American Meteorological Society. Bill.
And I'm going to...
And that doesn't mean to say, by the way, that you get all of Ortwin's time.
Right. Oh, shucks. Well, I'll be satisfied with 50% of it. How's that? So if you've been listening so far, you're probably thinking that what the world really needs is one more big research program to add to this. And what I'm going to do is report on a planning effort that's been underway by both ICSU, the International Council for Science, and ISSC, which you all know very well, to look at this problem. This group, or the succession of planning groups, has also no shortage of alternative things to do. So we would not be offering this program if we didn't think it had some unusual aspects and something that merit your attention. So this is a new initiative that's being put forward or stood up by ISSC and ICSU. It's an opportunity for all these different sectors that we've been talking about the last 45 minutes, the last couple of days, to work together. So it includes not just natural scientists, but also social scientists. It includes not just scientists, but practitioners. And it includes not just scientists and practitioners, but also the policymakers who make the decision framework that to a large extent determines whether all of those efforts by the practitioners and the scientists are effective. And it's working at this nexus of this problem, however you define it. And certainly when you get over into the realm of practice and policy, there's less interest in these definitions, like are we talking about climate adaptation, or are we talking about climate change adaptation, or are we talking about disaster risk management? So there are three major objectives, and these would be familiar to all of us. So part of it is characterizing the hazards. In this case, you can think of it as the physical threats, characterizing the societal vulnerability and the risk, understanding the character of decision-making that is taking place in these complex and changing risk contexts. And then finally, putting all that together and actually improving practice, reducing risk and curbing losses through knowledge-based actions. So there's a little more detail on each of these so that characterization of the hazards includes several elements. First is identifying the range of hazards that might fall into things that we need to worry about. Secondly, developing a kind of forecasting understanding of those hazards. And finally, dynamically modeling the risk, which you can think of as dynamic modeling of the coupled natural social system. So not a trivial problem. Then with regard to the decision making, there's identifying the relevant mechanisms. Again, identification. Second, understanding. And then third, improving the quality of the practice. And finally, here looking at some early ways that you can work to reduce the risks. They include doing vulnerability assessments and effective approaches here. Now, I want to discuss some of the cross-cutting themes for this program, because here I think is the piece of potentially the greatest interest. These address some of the points that you've heard previous speakers make about the need for new institutions or institutions with new attributes and the importance of learning from experience and so on. We're going to focus in particular on two that we wound up calling forensic case studies and demonstration projects and kind of advanced attention to data management. So how many people have seen this curve? It's in data from Munich Reinsurance. Okay, a reinsurance firm, the horizontal axis here, and maybe there's a pointer on this thing. Yeah, so this is 50-some years, half a century, and here are the losses in something like 100 billion, 200 billion US dollars per year, sort of adjusted to account for inflation. And what you see is signals noisy, quite noisy year to year, but there's kind of an exponential growth rate here that is faster than the growth of the world's economies. And that was before the last 6 months or so of experience. And the question that kind of engaged this group and was to a large extent the motivation behind our thinking was this question: why is it, despite the fact we know so much more about both the natural and the social causes of disasters, are losses continuing to mount? And if you were at the morning session, you know that some of the obvious reasons were posed there. We have more people. Those people have moved to more hazardous areas. And finally, they have a little more wealth at their disposal over time. And so there's a sense of inevitability about this. What we want to talk about for a minute or two here is that there are other factors at work. So Gilbert White, Bob Cates, and Ian Burton a few years ago wrote a paper suggesting that there might be several explanations of this curve. One is we might not have learned as much as we think. Secondly, we might have learned a lot, but nobody's using what we've learned. Third, they're using it ineffectively. Fourth, and this is kind of understandable, there's a time lag between learning something and putting it into practice because, as Alan pointed out, there's a lot of risk that's being created every day through construction practices and so on. It's kind of hard to fight that. Here's an example of a different loss history over this same 40, 50-year period. Here, and you can't see it very well in this room, there's a very noisy red curve here, which is the number of airplane accidents worldwide over the same period, 50 years. And it's noisy, but it's also, after the initial period here, it's about level throughout this entire period, even though takeoffs have quadrupled during this same period. And why is that? It's because this community has a culture of learning from experience. After every natural disaster in the US, you see couples on television saying, in effect, this is not exactly what they say, our grandfather condemned us to this flood by building the house here, and we're going to rebuild just like before. Okay, so the wing falls off the airplane, Do you say, we're going to rebuild this airplane just like before? No, at least in the United States, we have something called the National Transportation Safety Board that is the country's engine for learning by experience. And they lead an investigation. They don't carry it out by themselves. Many of the people wearing these shirts are people who have been seconded to the NTSB from the airline, the airframe manufacturer, the FAA, the National Weather Service of the United States, and so on. So they don't just look at pilot error, they look at all the causes and move forward. So we're talking in this program, and Gordon showed you, or he mentioned it during the question period. So there is this write-up of this program that describes, among other things, that piece. There's a second piece here which has to do with long-term research in areas where there is repetitive loss or risk. So you pick a community that has a repetitive hazard, whether it's earthquake or flood. The community has a different level, each community worldwide has a different level of technology development, of economic growth, different cultural kind of setting, different values, different engineering capabilities, and the hazards are different. So you've got many microcosms and opportunities, again, to learn from experience if you can sort of follow this year to year, decade to decade, whoops, and if you can sort of focus on enduring data sets. So you gather data over many decades, very often, at least, in the US, but also worldwide. After a disaster, social scientists spend a lot of time scrambling to get basic information prior, of what the social conditions were prior to the event. And here's an example where we kind of hope we'd get that data, those data in advance. So we've got some selection criteria for how we might go about this. There's a little bit of a preference for urban environments. There's also a sense that it has to be a coalition of the willing. If you take different cities worldwide, different countries worldwide, there's going to be a varying appetite for getting practitioners and researchers together to do this at kind of a community level. But we believe, and this is from the last paragraph of the report, that the establishment of a network like this has the potential to change cultures worldwide with respect to hazards, and replacing a mindset that is focused on emergency response, followed by rebuild as before, with a social approach that's based on building resilience and learning from experience and not repeating mistakes. And we think this shift would be perhaps the great legacy of this program. So we hope that you'll join with us in going forward. And if you've got any interest in this, you should pursue the fellow who's very modestly sitting in the back of the room there, Gordon McBain. Gordon, can you raise your hand for everyone? And he's leading this effort and has been for several years. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for also keeping impressively in time, as all the speakers have done. And given that we are short of one speaker, we now have a very good chance to have some conversation. I hope we won't just have sort of question and answer to individual speakers, but that we hopefully can actually have some conversation among the speakers, among the audience, and backwards and forwards. I think that would be very constructive. I am sort of just minded to note, before opening up completely to the floor, that it does seem to me that there's a lot of convergence of intention and goodwill around the program that Bill has just described, and yet it still seems to me that some of the tensions, intellectual tensions that were raised in the previous talks still exist. Bill's an old friend, so he won't mind me pointing out that from a social scientist point of view, particularly a social scientist coming out of the interpretive tradition of social science rather than out of the sort of stocks and flows tradition of social science, an order of business that starts with characterizing hazards and then characterizes decision making and then seeks to reduce threats still seems to represent in many ways some of the linearity that I think Colin and Alan were suggesting is problematic. And I think also in David's talk we saw some different models about how people are conceptualizing issues around risk, around hazard, and around climate. I come out of a particular tradition in risk analysis and the theory of risk, which is that of Mary Douglas, and I think the biggest contribution that she made to the whole discourse about risk was to say that almost all preceding work in the field, the work done by the psychometricians in psychology and so on, focused on characteristics of the risk and their influences on the way people then behave towards that risk. Whereas what Mary Douglas says is actually look at the characteristics of the risk bearer. Why do we choose in different institutional settings to worry about the things we worry about and not about lots of other things which we could be equally worried about? So what's the process of risk selection, which she rooted very profoundly in institutional variability. And I think that that's something which I don't think that this is a something which cannot be reconciled to the kind of program that Bill's described, but I think that there's a lot more work to be done before we, I think, transcend the linearity. Bill, I'll give you a chance to have a go back at me, and then we'll open it up.
Just make a very quick observation. I'm not sure whether these microphones are working or not, but I think you have to look at this as a transition. So when automobiles were first invented, one of the things you'd see in the United States is some manufacturers put an artificial horse's head in front of the automobile so as not to spook horses that were, pulling carriages coming the other way. Similarly, we've only belatedly, some years after personal computers, gotten Kindles, right? We're still carrying around paper-bound books and so on. So think of this as an attempt to try to merge these two, but with a long way to, the synthesis still has a long way to go. So okay. I agree with you, but I hope you'll be gentle.
I thought I was, Bill. Okay, let's open discussion up to the floor. If you want to address a question to a particular speaker, please do so. Otherwise, feel free to engage in discussion. I'm going to start with Desmond McNeil because I happen to know his name, and then I'll go on to other people. Desmond.
Thanks very much. Yes, I want to be a little less gentle, sort of mix it a bit, because I think that exactly the point that this you just raised is crucial. And taking Steve's example of building high-rise in Miami, I think firstly it's very relevant just point about Mary Douglas and looking at the decision rather than risk, but also if you take that a little further, why are they building those high-rise? And it has to do with political factors, economic factors, and so on. So I think it's slightly more challenging than to simply say let's synthesize these two approaches. I think if you ask those sort of questions, you'll come up with a very different sort of model.
Right, and that's one of the reasons we're very focused on this idea of an NTSB kind of analog. Because, again, in the aircraft experience, the National Transportation Safety Board simply does an analysis of what they think went wrong. The design of the wing was incorrect, or the maintenance of the wing was incorrect, or the manufacturer of the wing was incorrect. They issue these findings. People are subject to litigation and real punishment if they don't change practice. And we feel that community leaders, at least in the US, county officials, the rest of it, they don't have that kind of feedback and accountability when it comes to, in fact, the term natural disaster tends to give policymakers and practitioners a free pass, doesn't it? I can't help it that our factory, which we built in the floodplain, was flooded. It was a natural disaster. So we're trying to move somehow out of that, and we see this as a small vehicle that might have a viral effect in terms of changing behavior.
Of course, all analogies are imperfect, and immediately people will note that you don't, generally speaking, have the same sense of place and identification with an aircraft that you travel in a transitory way to the place where perhaps you're born and brought up. Right. Alan, do you want to come in on this? Please, will all speakers refrain from blowing into, tapping on, etc. microphones? Just speak into it, and the technicians will make magic happen. Trust the institutional arrangements.
Basically, that's why I never use PowerPoints, because everything I touch does blow up. 2 points. I think the comment about linearity, etc., and the complexity of getting together a research program which is intentionally multidisciplinary, would like to be something more inter-transdisciplinary. My experience from this with the guys we were on the committee with, there were 14 of us, could be summed up in the comment of one of the members, who was a geophysicist, I won't mention his name, who said to me, getting towards the end of the process, that he only understood like 15% of what I said. And I said to him, well, I actually understand everything you say. I'm not sure what that says about geographers and geophysicists, but there is a problem of the communality of language to getting towards a statement. In Latin America, we are very convinced of the approach you're talking about, what you have just indicated. We have done a lot to transform government institutions from being risk response institutions towards development-based prospective management. That means your investment decisions are crossed by, etc. But it's a difficult process. But I think what we've just heard, for instance, is typical of what I was saying about the difficulty of communication. For instance, Steve just used Mary Douglas's work, which is excellent, and Wildavsky, etc., where she said the risk occurrence or something similar. To me, for instance, from my perspective, a risk never occurs. Risk is the probability of future damage and loss. So it is hazard, exposure, vulnerability, interacting in complexity. And that means the explanation of the reasons why these people are on the beach comes on understanding hazard, not as the physical fact. I think the social sciences, when they came into it, transformed the notion of hazard as being the physical event itself, which is the way it is still used in many circles, to being the potential for danger and loss associated with a physical event. And how does a physical event get transformed from a physical event into a hazard? Through vulnerability and exposure. So I mention this because it is the complexity of the communication. You look at the word vulnerability is interpreted in so many different ways. That's why Terry Cannon and Ben Wisner are now on a campaign to change this indiscriminate use of it. Resilience, somebody told me there was a thesis done, a doctorate thesis on resilience, the interpretation, where the word comes from, etc. So, and I think, but you raise it's a really interesting point, and I think it's a challenge that this type of program is going to have to face up to. We're going to have to consolidate our mutual understanding. We're going to have to get to a minimum level of understanding of the concepts which are central, but more of the processes which are central. I think we're going to lose a lot of time on the understanding of a term, whereas what is really interesting is having a common view of the problem.
Right, but I think you have nicely illustrated what the challenges are, particularly as risk as an ordinary language category. At one end of a sort of Wittgensteinian resemblance chain is the probability and magnitude of a particular level of loss. At the other end, it has no probabilistic content at all. It's entirely about people's comfort levels with arrangements for trust, liability distribution, and consent arrangements. Gentleman at the back, and then I'm going to take Dick at the very back.
Hello, my name is Birger Held from Folke.
Sorry, could you speak up? Yeah. And perhaps stand up. There's a microphone right here if you can get to it.
Yeah, I'm Birger Held from Folke Sweden, and I don't know if you mentioned this, but sometimes we speak about risk and sometimes we speak about early warning. And where has been progress in research, in your view? We speak about risk. I think we can say where something will happen. We know where earthquakes are going to happen. We pretty much know with what magnitude they will be. In a sense, I think, for example, in research on genocide, the situation is the same. We pretty much know where genocide is going to happen. And the actions seem to be, well, you put the high-risk cases on sort of watch list. You carefully follow them and so on. But the missing piece, the Holy Grail, might here be early warning. It might tell us when something is going to happen. So have we made any progress in that case? I think in earthquake research, as I understand, the deep Earth physics is so advanced that we can't really say with any reasonable degree of specificity when we will have an earthquake. We will have early warnings or perhaps late warnings, but we haven't really progressed more than that. And I think the situation is basically the same in genocide research. The missing piece there is really the early warning.
Thank you. Dick, would you?
Dick Heiss, Sheffield, psychology, member of the... Do I need it? I can shout. Okay. I'm Dick Heiss. I'm a psychologist from Sheffield in the UK, and I'm part of Gordon's committee and its predecessor that produced this report. A couple of things on linearity and learning. Is that better? Yeah, okay. I think if colleagues here would read the report, I think they might well feel a little more comforted by the issue of it being a kind of dominated by a linear technocratic model. There is a history here, of course, that although now the programme has the two joint sponsors whose symbols up there, when it started it was from ICSU, it was from the science, more the physical science base, but has brought in more of the social sciences, people like Alan and myself. And I think that that transition is there. But right at the beginning, we were saying risk and disasters don't happen just because of geophysical or meteorological things, but because of the interaction and juxtaposition of physical and human systems. So that was there. And of course, linear books all have to have a chapter 1 and then a chapter 2. So, you know, you can fight over the league position, but really that wasn't the issue. Learning from experience. Very much there was something in Colleen's, one of her slides that would be good to talk about later, and then Bill's thing. One thing that I think is a problem is that learning as a process is asymmetrical. That when you have aircraft accidents, you know that something's gone wrong. When an aircraft flies and lands safely, you don't necessarily know that it's done it safely. Within the aircraft industry, of course, there is the whole culture of looking at near misses, which is again a very good thing. But I think for many hazardous activities, including poor building, you don't know it's a poor building, not really, until it falls down. And I think that is one of the issues that we will be trying to address, is how to analyze, maybe in your forensic studies, poor practices that themselves come about through the difficulty of learning from experience when accidents happen rarely. And so, I mean, what, I think it was Alan was saying, also the rare events, and you, Steve, that we shouldn't only look at the very rare extreme events, but at the others that happen all the time. Okay.
Thank you, Dick. I mean, your example of the buildings reminds me of what another aspect of the Homestead, Florida phenomenon in Hurricane Andrew, which was one builder in Homestead didn't lose a single roof. All the others did. You know the name of this builder. Does anybody know who it is? Shout it out.
Habitat for Humanity.
It was Habitat for Humanity. When asked why, they said, we're a voluntary organization. We built a code. So actually, this illustrates, I think, the institutional problems where everybody actually knows how to build a house that will keep its roof on in a hurricane. It's the institutional problems of getting the builders to build the code, the enforcement mechanism to keep it going, and so on and so forth. The other thing which I thought was fascinating was you reminded me of your remarks about different starting places. Some of us, I'm sure, have been to the kind of play where you get to vote for the ending, and you can have different alternative endings. I wonder if we can actually have a research program where you can vote for alternative different starting points, but end up with the same ending. Let me tell you what I'm going to do. Ortwin Wren has arrived. I'm going to carry this conversation on for about another 7 or 8 more minutes on this current track, and then I'm going to give Ortwin his 12 minutes of fame. And I'm going to take next the gentleman at the back in the red shirt, please.
Thanks, Simon from South Africa. I appreciate the good intentions that have been expressed in various presentations, but the discourse that prevails here seems to be different from the discourse that I'm familiar with, especially which is articulated and predominates within the World Social Forum, where the call is for a different world order to addressing the root causes rather than managing the problem. So none of you seem to be mentioning that discourse, which is calling for a radical change from the current way of doing things, the human activities and the neoliberal capitalist system, which is global and hegemonic, seems to be a major problem. And I think it hasn't been addressed and appreciated in this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take up that theme? They'd be welcome to do so. The next speaker is the gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm Ron Westrom, and I'm very interested in the organizational learning process. And I have, I think, what is a very useful scale for thinking about how organizations learn. On the worst end of it, you have people who shoot the messenger, okay? The second level of this, basically you encapsulate the message. This is a little nicer, at least you don't die for having reported the bad news. Then you get public relations. So the message gets out, but you give some context, okay? The next stage is to fix the immediately presenting problem, a local fix. Then you get what the airlines have pioneered, in my mind, and that is the global fix, where if you find it wrong with one airframe, you tend to assume that it's wrong with other similar ones. And then finally, on the sort of high learning end of it, you get a generative system which conducts an inquiry and tries to find out the root causes. I think it's very useful when we're talking about organizational learning to realize we can move from left to right. And what we see in the more successful organizations is indeed a concentration on the other things. And of course, those of you who are familiar with my work know that I've characterized organizational environments as ranging from the pathological, which I think is self-explanatory, the bureaucratic, and the generative on the other end. And I think one of the interesting things is to contemplate what's the interorganizational field doing? How generative is it? And are there some that are more generative than others? I think NTSB is an excellent example. And I think maybe we can think about going from the pathological end of things to at least the bureaucratic and eventually to a more generative system.
Thank you. I wonder if David or Colleen would like to address the applicability of that model to your own particular cases briefly. Yes? No?
Yeah, I need to think about
Move forward to the mic though, Colleen, or come up here.
Yeah, I think I'd need to think of it a little bit. I guess the problem where I'm coming from is that because the science is uncertain, I've just come back from a meeting on extreme events where the IPCC were trying to put together a special panel on extreme events. And what was really interesting was that the scientists in the room, the hardcore kind of scientists, were saying, we can't tell you when droughts are going to occur with any reliability. We know they're going to, but we don't know when they're going to come, how frequent they're going to be, what will be their magnitude. And yet in the community out there, because of the previous IPCC report, are already saying, so where I work, they're already saying they're becoming more frequent with greater magnitude. So I guess what I'm grappling with is how far can one actually go with this stuff in the area that I work in terms of adaptation. I believe at the moment we're just coping, we're just muddling through. So I'd love to get to generative and all kinds of other things. But I'm not really sure where the entry point at the moment is. And I think that's the thing that I'm really struggling with. How credible is that information? How legitimate is it? How salient is it? And I think we're assuming sometimes that we have something that's absolutely perfect. And I think perhaps, I don't know, I'd love to talk to you afterwards about this generative stuff, but I think for me, it's kind of muddling through at the moment, as opposed to, something really that is, easily identifiable and that you can track from one point to the other. But I think it's the nature of the science, both from the hardcore biophysical science and then knowledge construction and how that happens in the social sciences and the communities that I work with. So it's really messy out there. Navigating through that mess is what keeps me hopefully not too grey.
David.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Thanks, Colleen.
Just one of the challenges of community-based programs is that you are often giving resources down to a community level to try new initiatives to bring about a level of preparedness or an environmental improvement to a problem at a local level. And you need the mechanisms and the opportunities for that learning, but if it's at a community level, they are often disconnected to the neighbouring community that might be doing something. So I think we not only have to think about how we do things moving away from a top-down imposed provision of hazard information, for example, to more community-based, discovering what their hazards is and finding creative solutions, but to share that process so they can learn, or you can learn from a neighbouring community or some other more national practice, or from some other part of your nation or another country, how to do things. So there is a challenge to put empower the local community, but also give them a framework and an opportunity and a mechanism for learning how to do it, how to improve it, how to improve that practice.
Thank you. Any other people want to come in on the gentleman here?
Well, I have, this is Kuni Takeuchi from Japan, International Center for Water Hazard and Risk Management, which is called ICHAR. This is a UNESCO center. Well, I have a different view on this build as before or perception. I think the most of the countries in the world as a whole, I think whenever they have some disaster, they have new code, and they are going to build a better one, unless they don't have enough money. That is that is the real kind of the constraint, the poverty and governance. And you are talking about the governance part of it, but the poverty is the main driver of the constraint. By the way, I think the one most important thing is land ownership. Because land ownership is so difficult to change, therefore they build the house at the same place. And all the government try to protect those areas. Like in the New Orleans in Katrina, they are saying this area will be much, much safer than before. And that is true. And also, they are providing the guidance to make a piloty for the houses. So I think the government is doing as much as possible, and the people are somehow following. However, land ownership is so difficult, and this is the real problem. And maybe land ownership can be transferred to some other places in the United States or some big country, but most of the small countries, we don't have space. So this is the area where the social scientists they come together with the decision makers, to make the key to change this land ownership from one place to the other.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give, as I say, in his 12 minutes of fame, we haven't had a chance to meet up beforehand, so I haven't been able to forewarn him of my draconian approach to timing, but I'll give you a 2-minute warning and then stop you at 12 minutes, Orwin. We'll then have a little bit more question and answers, and then what I propose to do is to just have a last brief sweep along the panel for a few final comments. Please keep those to a minute or two, okay, when we come to that, but you may want to be thinking about that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Ortwin Wren, please.
So thank you very much, Steve, for allowing me the 12 minutes of fame, and you have to decide whether it's fame or not. I have prepared a couple of slides, but I won't show them because it would take more time. I sincerely apologize for being late. I came late into Amsterdam this morning, and I missed the flight to Bergen and had to take the second one, so that's why I'm here. I just came from the airport and rushed here in order to be here, at least for the 12 minutes I'm allowed to talk. What I would like to take the sense with seriously what was said before in the introduction, and certainly in the panel session description, to make the link between the climate change community and the disaster risk management community. And I try to ask myself, what is the link? And I was also asked to think more about the management side and less so much about the assessment side. And when we talk about management in terms of disaster as well as in terms of climate change and adaptation, we're basically dealing with three types of problems. And those problems we refer to as risk governance problems. Number one is that the causal chain seemed to be more complex than any before, which makes it very difficult to really develop easy or easily sensibly models for deterring and for finding out what is the cause and what is the effect. Which leads to the second point, which is uncertainty. There are different types of uncertainty. I don't want to go deeply into it, but the uncertainty really is one of the problems by which we are not quite sure neither about the extent of the damage nor about the probability of that happening. And then the third thing, which we call ambiguity, is basically saying that even if we know, or even if you think we know, we may have very different opinions on what it means. And these three elements, complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, are the ones that I think are the major links between the two types of communities that we're talking about, because the two communities face exactly the same three problems. And now what does that mean in terms of risk and disaster management? Well, let me first talk a little bit about complexity. Complexity, in a sense, has its special meaning in the way that we, in a sense, model, or in a sense that we even construct our knowledge about what leads to what. And the more complex the world is, the more we're getting into a kind of a construction process by which we're not totally sure whether it really matches the type of reality that we would like to simulate. And in a sense, between these two big camps of constructivism and realism, the more the world we see as a complex endeavor, the more we're getting to be constructivists almost by force. And the simpler it is, the more we can get to be realists, because then we can really observe if things are right or wrong. Now, in terms of climate change, adaptation, and disaster, we feel that the world has become more complex, that it's more difficult really just from observation to find out how well our models actually perform. And that means in terms of complexity that several models are competing with each other, so we have to live with somehow a plurality of different knowledge claims. So that's number one, and that makes it very difficult for management to address complex issues, because we always have different knowledge claims competing with each other, and now we have to see which ones we believe and which ones we don't believe in. And since there is no clear yardstick for making sure what we believe is correct or not correct, it becomes almost a fight of beliefs. Secondly, uncertainty. Well, the uncertainty issue is one that I think is very interesting, because a lot of scientists try to address this issue of uncertainty by pointing out maybe confidence intervals by various distribution, using Monte Carlo distribution, whatever kind of statistical methods. But in the end, what it means is that we have no clear scientific or knowledge-based prediction of how often and when and to what extent these kind of disasters will happen. And given that kind of uncertainty, all issues of more scientific input into characterizing this risk may be not of a strong advantage to risk management systems, because in the end they'll say we don't know. I mean, that's maybe oversimplified. But if we keep that situation, then the so-called risk-based approach in disaster management, as well as in climate change adaptation, may not work very well. A risk-based approach is basically you spend your resources according to the magnitude of the risk. Now, if you don't know the magnitude of the risk, you're very uncertain about it, you don't know how many resources you'd spend on what type of method. And then I think a fundamental shift towards what we call resilience-based approach is necessary. And a resilient-based approach is basically an approach by which you try to design management methods not according to some kind of a probability distribution of adverse effects, but rather based on declining or trying to get less vulnerable in your system, to have more kind of redundancy, more diversity, more protective ways, even in the presence of potential surprises that can happen. So uncertainty management is basically built upon the premise that you'd like to have either an infrastructure or some kind of a system that can easily adapt to stress or to other kinds of negative impacts that might affect your system. Now, there are a whole set of management tools to do that, and I have them all on my slides, and I can send them to you if you like to. It starts from containment methods in which you contain basically some kind of your functions. You have multiple functional systems that try to have the same service being done by different functions. So there are different organizational methods to deal with that. The third major aspect, as I said, is ambiguity. Ambiguity basically means that looking at these different types of evidence, looking at the different knowledge claims, looking at a situation in which you feel you are uncertain about the outcomes and the probabilities of these events. This basically invites all kinds of, well, different types of interpretation and also different types of judgments. And these different types of judgments are not just a part of the scientific community, neither the social science community nor the natural science community. But in that sense, and that's also for me the most important reason, to get more and more thorough stakeholder involvement in the evaluation and management process. Because in a sense, if you're not totally sure about your knowledge, if you're not sure when and at what magnitude things are happening, you should be designing a system by which people who will be affected by the consequences have something to say about the level of protection, the level of resources that are put into the system. And as the gentleman before said, it's all a question of funding and poverty and system. Well, let those people, in a sense, decide who are part of that local, regional, whatever system, in which way those resources for risk management are being distributed and then being used. This means, and that is not a trivial conclusion, that most part of bringing these two communities together is not just to bring two scientific communities together, but rather to make sure that those who are affected by disasters and by global climate change have something to contribute to the interpretation table on one side and to the management table on the other side. Now, that's easier said than done. I know it's very politically correct to say that. 2 minutes left, that's great. And we are working on trying to design methods in which we can actually make sure that the best of stakeholder participation can be brought into the process without kind of making the process so cumbersome that it doesn't work, or to open these processes just to very, selective interests. In my 2 minutes, I'm not able to say all of that, how to do this, but I'm pretty sure from how we have gained our own experience that if you design the right kind of stakeholder involvement process, you can get a much better handle to deal and to cope with this ambiguity thing. And at the second point, you also find then ways how to handle uncertainty and how to reduce complexity. So in essence, what I would like to say, the two communities, the climate change community as well as disaster management community, share the three major challenges of complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity. And three things are basically needed. We need very good scientific forums in which complexity are being discussed. We need stakeholder participation where too much or not enough protective action is being discussed as a part of a strategy against uncertainty. And we need specifically an involvement process that brings into the forefront, into the public, the different interpretations and the way to resolve them. Thank you very much.
Colleen, would you like to come back and sit in the hot seat? Thank you very much, Ortwin. Ortwin, you didn't hear yesterday Amartya Sen say it's better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. We've heard him say this before. Of course, I don't think you are suggesting, but I think it's important to clarify that you're not suggesting that the participatory collective is inevitably right and that the hierarchical expert is inevitably wrong. It is possible to be collectively wrong and hierarchically right, of course, but the problem is you don't know that until until largely it's too late to do anything about it. And so we're still, I think, faced with some of these problems that you earlier mentioned, of the problems of complexity and ambiguity and so on. They don't go away with public participation. Let's take a few comments or questions inspired by Ortwin's presentation, then we have a few minutes for a bit more general discussion, and then I'm going to ask the panel to close. Who would like to speak? Maybe one of the other panelists. Alan.
Yes. No, I just want to say that I think what Ortwin has just said is absolutely spot on. You know, the work we are attempting to do in Latin America, for instance, with the concept of participation in local risk management practices, and where participation is not, we have a friend who declines the verb to participate. I participate, you participate, we participate, and they decide. This is not the type of participation we're talking about. We're talking about the participation as the social construction of knowledge, the appropriation of knowledge. And when it comes to environments in change, there are no better people to identify those changes than the people themselves. You know, there's a statement, where there is no doctor, what do? You just give up. Where there's no geologist, you just give up. Where there's no geophysicist, you just give up. No, you can help communities to construct knowledge of their own environment, and therefore on a continual, iterative basis, adjust to, and I'm going to avoid avoid using the word adapt. I don't like it. I would much prefer Gilbert White and adjustment, you know, a beautiful phrase in the early 70s. And if adaptation is defined as being the adjustment to, why don't we just use adjustment, which is less committing, scientifically, historically. Darwin and Russell would give a turn in the grave if they could see the imprecise way this has been used. So I just purely, along with the social construction of risk as a notion, the social construction of knowledge is fundamental. In organizational terms, taking up on organizational learning, what we're trying to do in Latin America is to get rid of the organizations which are in fact impeding advance from a development perspective. We cannot work with civil defenses when we are talking about reducing risk as a variable in development. It has to come through development organizations. We don't want, at the local level, disaster risk reduction units. We want development, land use planning, land territorial planning units where risk is incorporated. And I come back to this, it'll be my minute, I'm now saying it, is that the idea of risk management as something you add on to development, we have to get rid of. You don't add on risk management stuff to development. You can't define development without security. And therefore risk management and adaptation, if you like it, are intrinsic parts of the development planning process, sectorally and territorially. We are not there because the institutions which are there, the organizations, come from 40 years ago precisely with the Cold War in Latin America. I'm talking about the creation of civil defense structures for response, and we have changed enormously our approach, but we haven't changed the institutions to support that approach.
Thank you, Alan. And of course, you use the phrase social construction of knowledge. One thing we haven't really surfaced very strongly in the discussion thus far is the social construction of ignorance, by which I mean institutions evolve precisely to keep out information which makes their lives difficult and makes it impossible for them to perform. Some of those institutions do things we want. They're not all ones that are simply outmoded and that we would like to dispense with. So there are problems here. There are real problems. It's not just sort of a notion of knowledge not being sufficiently well packaged or appropriately packaged and communicated to sort of hydrological theory of knowledge, if you like, or information. We actually have institutions that do things that we want them to do, and in order to do them, they have to block out certain kinds of information that in other contexts or settings we would like them to have. And that's a real problem, it seems to me, is this question of the social construction of ignorance. The gentleman at the back would like to come in, please.
Just my name's Steve Sparks. I'm from Bristol University, and I'm also a member of Gordon's panel for IRDR. Perhaps just a little bit of a riposte to the issue of where the physical sciences can play a role. And the uncertainty issue is particularly important there. A few weeks ago, I heard one of my country's ministers say that in 2010, the climate will definitely be exactly 4 degrees warmer, and the sea level will be exactly 60 centimetres or a metre higher. In other words, distilling all the IPC work down into a very simple, misinformed view with no account of the uncertainty. So we might have in one construct the idea that all this is so uncertain, the science is so uncertain, we won't bother with the science. I'd like to take a different view of that there really are scientific advances which are going to be able to improve our predictive capability significantly. And I'd just take one example, which is the ability from space to image the topography of the Earth in a great deal more detail than we've ever been able to do before, and to take information about the surface of the Earth and use that to really highlight which areas are vulnerable in a quite precise way, which areas are vulnerable and which are at risk. And when this technology develops, as it is rapidly, we'll be in a much better position scientifically to provide useful information with uncertainties to really understand these sort of complex systems.
Thank you, Steve. And I know that work is a great comfort to David as a New Zealander, since some of it shows that with a certain amount of sea level rise, New Zealand will in fact be larger than Australia. Are there any more contributions that people would like to make? Colleen.
I just wonder, one of the problems about this mainstreaming development and climate adaptation is that in the bigger regime where these things get negotiated, that raises quite a lot of tension, though, because funders will say, but we're already giving you development aid. Now distinguish for us what you want in terms of adaptation. So I hear what you're saying about this twinning, and we keep pushing it in my country, but it is raising some interesting tensions at higher levels where these negotiations can take place. So I just want to throw that out there. One has to sometimes actually clarify what you mean by that as well, but I'll just throw that in.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any last comments or questions that people would like to raise from the floor? Yes, again.
Well, sorry to be twice.
You've come a long way.
I also like to talk about this uncertainty. And I'm very, very fond of your idea. From risk-based approach to resilience-based approach. I think this is very, very important area. Within the risk-based approach, one single the ministry or the Bureau can do everything. But the resilience-based approach, the one ministry cannot do anything because we are looking at different solutions. That is not in just the building is concerned, but also land use or how to live, lifestyle, everything. So I think ISDR, IRDR has to really come into how can we make this resilience-based approach possible? This is the really important area where not only just scientists, but also social scientists and decision makers come along. And I think this is a very, very important area. Well, I like to say
thank you very much. Okay, we're now going to move to the final stage in our discussion. I'm going to invite each of the panelists to speak for a maximum of 2 minutes with some final closing comments. And I'm going to start at the end with David, please. You can either do it from there or come up here, whichever you prefer.
In allocating the time, I cut out a lot of slides, and what I was going to show you, but I'll speak to briefly, was, and it has a point to this, some work we did in Istanbul in 2005 looking at retrofitting options for seismic safety. And it was an interesting project where it was largely an engineering project. A team from Turkey and from New Zealand examined 369 buildings and were looking at engineering solutions to reduce the seismic risk. As an addition to it, a social impact assessment was undertaken by myself and a psychologist from the Middle Eastern Technical University. And what we concluded as a team, including the engineers, that the buildings themselves weren't the problem. And I think this is quite well known in this circles. And that most of the barriers to reducing the risk were human factors. They were factors around trust in the authorities, the builders, trust in retrofitting options. It was about beliefs in the risk, about the costs, who should bear it, and mechanisms for bringing about change. We discovered that the majority of the 369 buildings had a high risk of collapsing in the next earthquake that has a 60% chance in the next 30 years. So as a dire prediction, I think Istanbul potentially will be the first urban centre where we potentially kill over 1 million people in a single event. It is a time bomb waiting to happen. But the bulk of the effort has been around engineering solutions to the problem. And I think that the group in this project were quite aware that it alone and the knowledge of the engineering, the geology, the seismic hazard was not going to bring about the risk reduction we wanted. And we really needed to find further ways. And it's good to see that this group, bringing the social and physical scientists together, is making progress towards that, because I think as much as the social scientists often conceptualize these as social problems, there are physical things we need to know that we can't do it without the physical scientists, and likewise the physical scientists need the social scientists. So I will reiterate Steve Sparks' comments. I started life in a physical science institute. I'm now a social scientist in a university, and I think that we'd like to see both disciplines really increasing their efforts to work together to find some solutions.
Thank you, David. Colleen.
First of all, thank you very much again for the chance to talk. I think we've come a long way in global change science, particularly in climate change. The science, or even though it's uncertain, we can do a lot. But I think we have a unique window of opportunity. I think we need to go beyond just communicating. It's not just an issue of making the communication simpler and easier, which obviously it's key, but I think there are a whole range of issues that we haven't started to touch on, behavioral issues, cultural dimensions. And in the area that I'm working in, I'm really intrigued and would love to share with some more card-carrying, really strong social scientists around these notions of organization and the institutional architectures and the ways of doing things. But I think the point that was raised earlier this afternoon is a critical one. It's our entry point. Where are we coming from? Are we just trying to, convince people that they need to become more resilient? Or are we going to try and go from the other side and actually find out what people's perceptions, their notions, how they're constructing their ideas of risk, and how we can then go through what I think Ren really very eloquently put together. I think those are the sorts of issues that we really need to grapple with. But those are issues that are going to require all our efforts. And having been part of this conference has been fantastic, and I can't profess to ever learn all that you people know. And so I think we need to find those entry points and not just always be physical scientists saying, aha, we've seen the light, and now we need to start quickly playing catch up. I think we need to do a joint effort. So I look forward to engaging with some of you further on some of those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Alan?
Very briefly. I think, just a statement, there is sufficient similarity between the areas of concern of the two topics for climate change and the adaptation and the risk management. They are not the same, obviously, there are differences, etc. But when we get to the similarities with dealing with what I call corrective and prospective risk, if you look at it on the ground, both methods used in disaster risk reduction and adaptation have many things in common, including the notion of participatory construction of risk scenarios in localities, etc., and there are a number of others. But also, if you look on the level of strategies of intervention, not the actual instruments one by one, but the strategies. What are the strategies which we see in both types of literature? They're the very same. One is environmental services, and land use and territorial planning, the use of microcredit and insurance, infrastructural improvements, and governance. Those are the five that come up in both types of literature because they are the basis of our intervention in the problem. So I invite us once more to go back to what is a development-based approach. I think it is, we can only draw these two together if we come from a common starting point. The only common starting point is development associated with resilience, resistance, and vulnerability reduction. And that is the only way of going forward as far as I'm concerned, and to be able to manage the uncertainties which so well has been put forward by Ortwin and the other commentators.
Thank you, Alan. And since you mentioned Ortwin, would you like to give us your closing summary, please?
Well, thank you very much. I think it was raised here in the last few minutes, the cooperation between the physical scientists and the social scientists. And I think there has been a major form of miscommunication between the two, that the natural scientists often feel attacked by the social scientists of being just narrators of science stories. And that constructivism means that they just invent their scientific stories, and the social scientists are the ones who kind of disclose interests and money and other kind of things in order to find out that all these physical scientists are basically inventing their facts according to their pocketbook. Now, this is exaggerated, I know, but I think we should be very aware of this kind of prejudice, and it doesn't help. I think we should need to be careful that many of the risks that we're talking about, the risk of ozone depletion, the risk of climate change, would probably not be in our memory or in our presence if scientists had not, for some reason, shown that these kind of threats exist. And we do this with many other things. BSE, we would have never known about it if people would have not, if there had been scientists, even scientists who were not on the mainstream line, to do that. And saying that even scientific knowledge has an element of constructivism does not mean that it's arbitrary. And I think it's very important to give the respect to the natural scientists who try very, very hard to calculate with a third or fourth digit what's out there, and then being confronted with some kind of a prejudice and saying, well, what you do is a big, nice narrative of the world. I think that doesn't help. And I think we should be very careful in finding out how that kind of cooperation works. And in some of the participatory processes in which I have been involved, I very often ask the natural scientists to say, look, we need to know from you the distance or the difference between the absurd and the possible. That's the first thing. There's things that are absurd. There's also a construction of nonsense. And there's a lot of nonsense constructed around the world, and we just shouldn't pay too much attention to them. Then there is a demarcation line between what's possible, what cannot be excluded, and what's probable, what's likely to event, and then, of course, the one between probable and certain. And these kind of demarcation lines are very important in any kind of policy making. And it can only come from people who have the knowledge to make those kind of distinctions. And then what I think what Alan said is very important, you have to find the environment in which these kind of judgments apply or not apply. But in all the participatory process that I was saying, it was very interesting when I said, well, there is some natural science knowledge available. Nobody said, we know it better. Actually, they asked me, please bring those scientists in, we want to know them. That kind of conflict is always being said. There's a local people who don't want to listen to natural scientists. There's the natural scientists who, are in a sphere that is totally different from what happened to the local phase. Most of the time, that's not the case. And I think the cooperation actually works better than many people think. But just to have to make sure that the organizers of these processes give a legitimate role to the science and the models that they can bring in. Actually, they try to give resolutions of complexity to people so they can understand and grasp it. But they need to be honest about the uncertainty. And that is a real problem because scientists, of course, don't like uncertainty. They're paid to reduce uncertainty. And so bringing uncertainty up front and making sure that this is the limit of what we know. And from here on, this is either experience, which is very important as a part of knowledge, or this is a way that you deal with these kind of uncertainty in a challenging way. That's something which I need, where participatory processes are really well positioned to do this and also to bring the various constituencies together.
Thank you, Ortwin. I'm not going to take 2 minutes, and I'm going to give the last word to Bill Hook. But I would just observe, actually, Ortwin, I think that the epistemological gulf is much closer to home than between the social and the natural sciences. Personally, I believe it lies right slap bang in the middle of the social sciences. Between those social sciences, such as economic paradigm, which can almost seamlessly flow into to natural sciences, particularly through modelling. You can take a carbon cycle model and an energy emissions model, bolt them together, and hey presto, you've got an integrated energy and carbon cycle model. No problem there. Similarly, you can take the interpretive side of the social sciences, examining meaning, motivation, understanding, and so on, and that blends seamlessly into the humanities. It seems to me that the gulf that is a really critical one is actually not the gulf between us and the natural sciences, but the one that lies right within our own community. And I'm afraid there that actually the mutual recrimination and rejection and non-cooperation and despising of each other's work is, I think, much more virulent and destructive than it is between the social and the natural sciences. So I agree with everything you said, but I just want to bring it closer to home and say I think it's a problem of our own community. With that, I'm going to give the last word to Bill Hook.
And I think behind that was an implication that it ought to be short. So let me just say one thing that I think it's important for all of us in this room to remember. We need, going forward, as scientists, and whether we want to subdivide that label into physical or natural or social, as scientists, we need to change our goal from the goal that we've had the last 50 years to a new goal. And this is a little harsh on us, but our goal for the last 50 years, or our main accomplishment of the last 50 years, is we have gotten better at documenting human and societal failure, of increasing scope and rapidity and complexity and reach. And we need to go from improved documentation of failure to changing what happens for the better. That when we make that transition, the complications of social science or the complications of natural science are going to pale. The differences that we have in this room are going to pale by comparison with the gulf between us and practitioners, and between policymakers and people who have a broader agenda. Gee, I'd love to think about your hazard that might or might not happen in the next 10 years, but I've got riots in the street now because people don't have jobs, or people are disenfranchised minorities, or we've got healthcare problems that we can't deal with, and so on. So we've got policymakers and practitioners kind of looking at this broad range of kind of urgent things. So we've got to move into a sort of culture of individual kind of responsibility and a culture of learning from experience, but mainly transitioning what we know into practice. Now, there was a lot of talk this last few minutes about uncertainty at our chair here. How many of you are familiar with this term, wicked problems? Ever heard that term? So, Horst Riddle, is that the guy that did something 30 years ago? And our chair did something more recently on this subject. Only a small number of hands went up. So Google that term. Google wicked problems and either Steve Rayner or Jack Beale lecture, and you'll get a paper that's worth reading. So here's what he talks about in terms of problems that are hard to solve. He talked about his Oak Ridge experience, and he's saying he's worked on these problems. So they have this kind of catechism of attributes. So they're comprehensive, so big as to almost be circular. They don't have alternative solutions. It's not like there are 3 solutions and we're trying to pick, you know. They have very little opportunity for trial and error learning. Okay, we heard about that. And the next one, and this is the one that sort of triggered this thought, contradictory certitudes. It's not that people are uncertain about what to do. Everybody's certain. We just all disagree. The next one was redistributive impacts and strongly entrenched interests. So faced with climate change or disaster resilience, we know we have to modify behavior, but for most of us in this room, we're giving up something at the same time. We're a little reluctant to do that. And the last one is there are no real solutions. There's only coping strategies. So with a bow to our chair, I'd suggest that we leave. We try to enter the world of practice, not cold turkey, but gradually, virally, you know, setting up these opportunities to learn from experience and go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. The check's in the mail, Bill. Thank you all very much for participating so actively in this afternoon's discussion. I hope you agree with me that it was a very fruitful and successful one, and we wish the people who are taking this joint research project forward the best of luck. You're going to need it. Thanks.